The police station sat in the quiet darkness of the late evening, its fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow on the worn-out desks and cluttered paperwork. The air smelled faintly of coffee and ink, the familiar scent of long shifts and sleepless nights. Officer Sarah Collins leaned back in her chair, stretching her arms over her head, exhaling slowly as she listened to the distant crackle of the police radio. It was one of those nights where nothing much happened. No reports of domestic disturbances, no calls about reckless drivers, not even a lost dog. The quiet was both a blessing and a curse, stretching time like taffy, making every second crawl. Across from her, Lucas Reed, her partner of 3 years, had his boots propped up on his desk, balancing a styrofoam cup of coffee on his chest, his eyes half-lidded with boredom. He'd been flipping through an old case file for the last 20 minutes, not reading so much as just staring at the words, his mind elsewhere. He yawned loudly, setting the cup aside, rubbing his eyes with the heel of his palm. "Hell of a night," he muttered, his voice dry and laced with sarcasm. Sarah smirked, glancing at the clock on the wall. "You mean a boring one?" Lucas shrugged, rolling his shoulders. "Same thing." Outside, the wind whispered against the windows, rattling the old panes with a steady rhythm. The street was deserted, the orange glow of streetlights flickering faintly in the distance. It was the kind of night that felt stretched thin, a pause in time where nothing moved, nothing breathed too hard, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then came the sound. 3 deep, deliberate knocks against the station's front door. Both officers stiffened instantly, their instincts kicking in before their minds could process it. Lucas swung his feet off the desk, his posture shifting from lazy to alert. Sarah's brows furrowed as she turned toward the entrance, her heartbeat picking up just slightly. It was past 10, too late for a civilian just walking in for directions, too late for a routine visit. People who needed help at this hour usually barged in, frantic and desperate, or they called first. They didn't knock. Lucas let out a low breath, standing up. Who the hell knocks on a police station door at this time of night? Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward cautiously, peering through the narrow window in the door. The outside lights buzzed faintly, illuminating the sidewalk beyond, but what she saw on the other side made her breath hitch in her throat. A bear. A massive, thick-furred, broad-shouldered bear stood just outside the station, its enormous paw still raised mid-air as if knocking. Sarah's brain struggled to make sense of it. The town had its share of wildlife, foxes, deer, the occasional coyote skirting the outskirts. But bears? They kept to the woods, away from the streets, away from people. They didn't come to police stations, and they certainly didn't knock. "Lucas," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. He was already beside her, his breath hitching when he followed her gaze. "You have got to be kidding me." The bear lowered its paw slowly, its black eyes locked onto Sarah's, and a shiver ran down her spine. There was something in its gaze, not the vacant wildness of an animal, not simple curiosity. No, there was something else, something that made the air in the room feel heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. It wasn't just looking at her. It was waiting. Lucas cursed under his breath. What the actual hell? Sarah didn't answer. She was too busy staring at the bear, at the dark, matted fur along its shoulder, where something glistened wetly under the streetlight. Blood. She exhaled, slow and measured, her instincts screaming at her to back away. A wounded animal was dangerous, unpredictable, but the bear wasn't acting like an animal in pain. It wasn't thrashing, growling, or retreating. It was standing still, waiting. And then, as if sensing her hesitation, it did something that made her stomach twist into knots. It lowered its head, not out of exhaustion, not out of weakness. It was deliberate, a slow, almost submissive motion. A plea. Lucas made a strangled sound beside her. Did it just? Yeah, Sarah murmured. The bear exhaled, a deep, low huff that sent mist curling in the cold air. Then it shifted its weight, lifting its head again, those dark eyes never leaving hers. Something cold crept into Sarah's chest. It wasn't just hurt. It had come here for help. The rational part of her brain screamed that this was insane, that she should lock the door and call animal control. But another part, something deeper, something instinctual, told her to stay. Her fingers tightened around the door handle. Lucas noticed. Oh, hell no. You are not seriously. She ignored him. With a slow, measured breath, she unlatched the door. The hinges creaked as she pushed it open just an inch, then two. The bear remained still. The cool night air rushed in, thick with the scent of earth, pine, and that unmistakable metallic tang of blood. Sarah stepped past the threshold, her breath steady, her body poised to react to the slightest sign of aggression. But there was none. The bear's eyes flickered, something shifting in its posture. Relief? Then it did something even stranger. It turned its head, glancing toward the darkened road that stretched beyond the station. It held there for a moment, as if waiting for her to follow its gaze. Then it looked back at her expectant. Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears. It wanted her to see something. She turned to Lucas. His jaw was clenched, his posture tense. "Do we follow it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "This is the dumbest thing we've ever done." Sarah didn't disagree. But deep down, she already knew the answer. Because whatever this was, whatever had brought this wounded bear to their doorstep, it wasn't just chance. And it wasn't over yet. The cold air pressed against Sarah's skin, seeping through the fabric of her uniform as she followed the massive creature into the darkened forest. Every rational part of her screamed to stop, to turn back, to call for backup, but there was something about the way the bear moved, deliberate, steady, with purpose, that made it impossible to ignore. The trees loomed tall and skeletal under the pale glow of the moon, their twisted branches clawing at the sky like grasping fingers. The ground beneath her boots grew softer, the gravel giving way to dirt, then to the dense, damp earth of the woods. The scent of pine mixed with the distant tang of blood, its metallic bitterness lingering in the crisp night air. The further she walked, the more the town faded behind them, swallowed by shadows, until it was nothing but a distant memory. Lucas was right behind her, his breath quickened, tense. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath, though his steps never faltered. He wasn't going to let her go in alone, no matter how reckless it seemed. "We're actually following a damn bear into the woods. I just want that on record when they find our bodies." His sarcasm was his shield, his way of coping with the creeping dread that slithered through the dark. Sarah didn't respond, her attention fixed on the animal leading them. It didn't hesitate. It didn't stop to look back at them. It just moved, weaving through the trees with an eerie certainty, as if it had walked this path 1,000 times before. The wound on its shoulder was still fresh, the blood dark against the thickness of its fur, but it showed no sign of pain, no limp, no slowing down. The way it carried itself, with that same unsettling intelligence she had noticed back at the station, made something cold curl in her stomach. The ground dipped slightly as they entered a clearing, the moonlight spilling in through the break in the canopy above. Sarah's boots crunched against fallen leaves, and then she saw it, a torn piece of fabric half buried in the damp soil. It was small, dark, frayed at the edges, and when she knelt to pick it up, she saw the unmistakable stain of blood smeared across the cloth. Lucas crouched beside her, his fingers brushing against the ground as he examined the area. His jaw clenched. That's not just animal blood. He didn't need to say the rest out loud. They both knew what this meant. The bear huffed, a deep, rumbling sound that sent vibrations through the earth. It took another step forward, its massive paw landing with purpose, before it turned its head slightly, eyes flickering toward the darkness beyond the clearing. Sarah followed its gaze. Her breath caught in her throat. There, just beyond the twisted roots of a fallen tree, something was slumped against the underbrush. A man. He was barely visible in the dim light, his body twisted awkwardly, one arm limp at his side while the other lay bent at an unnatural angle across his chest. His clothes were ripped, stained with blood, and his face, pale beneath the grime and bruises, was motionless. Sarah moved before she could think, her boots digging into the soft earth as she crossed the clearing. She dropped to her knees beside him, pressing 2 fingers to the side of his neck, her own pulse hammering beneath her skin. A heartbeat. Weak. unsteady. But there! Lucas exhaled sharply beside her. Jesus, he muttered, eyes scanning the surrounding darkness, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster. What the hell happened to him? Sarah shook her head, her mind racing. The man's breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling in uneven, ragged intervals. There were deep gashes along his arms, his torn jacket barely clinging to his frame, and one of his legs was twisted in a way that made her stomach turn. Whatever had happened to him, it wasn't an accident. Someone or something had done this. The bear stood a few feet away, watching, its large body partially silhouetted against the trees. It didn't move closer, didn't make a sound, but the way it held itself, tense, ears flicked forward, made Sarah feel like it was waiting for something. Lucas shifted beside her, bringing his radio to his mouth. But the moment he pressed the button, a sound echoed from the darkness beyond the clearing. A rustling. Not the wind. Not an animal. Something else. Something moving. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Lucas stiffened, his hand tightening around his gun. Did you hear that? Sarah swallowed hard. Her eyes locked on the dense shadows between the trees. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate step. Then another. Careful. Measured. The bear let out a low, guttural growl. Sarah's breath hitched. The rustling stopped. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. Then movement. Fast. Sudden. A figure darted between the trees, too quick to make out, but there was no mistaking it. Someone or something was watching them. Lucas was on his feet in an instant, gun raised, scanning the darkness. Show yourself. His voice was sharp, cutting through the heavy air. Nothing. Just the wind whispering through the leaves. Sarah turned back to the injured man. They didn't have time for this. We need to get him out of here. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she reached under his arm, trying to lift him. He groaned weakly, his eyelids fluttering, but he was too far gone to do anything more. Lucas hesitated, his stance still rigid, eyes still locked on the trees, but after a moment, he holstered his weapon and crouched beside her. All right, let's move. They struggled to lift him, his weight heavy, his body uncooperative, but they managed to hoist him between them. The bear moved closer. Sarah braced herself, but instead of blocking their path, it did something that made her heart pound even harder. It turned and walked beside them, like a guardian, like a protector. Lucas let out a shaky breath. I have no idea what's happening right now. Sarah didn't either, but she knew one thing. Whatever had attacked this man was still out there, and it wasn't done yet. The night had deepened into an inky black, the forest swallowing every trace of light as Sarah pressed forward, her breath coming in sharp, controlled bursts. The weight of the unconscious man dragged against her shoulder, his limp body forcing her muscles to strain with every step. Lucas was beside her, just as exhausted, his jaw clenched, his fingers tight around the injured man's arm as they struggled to keep moving. The ravine sloped steeply downward, the ground beneath them slick with damp earth, the scent of pine and decaying leaves thick in the cold air. And ahead of them, the bear led the way. Its enormous form moved with silent certainty, its powerful paws pressing into the dirt without hesitation. Sarah had no doubt now. This wasn't a wild animal acting on instinct alone. It had brought them here for a reason. It had shown them the first man, half dead, bleeding, barely clinging to life. And now it had guided them further into the trees, where another body lay crumpled at the bottom of the ravine. Her stomach twisted. 2 missing men, both barely alive. Nick Aldrich. She knew his name now, recognized his face from the missing persons report that had been circulating for 2 days. His photo had been plastered on news bulletins, his family pleading for information, their voices cracking with desperation. And here he was, his body twisted unnaturally, his skin deathly pale beneath the dried blood and bruises, his pulse so faint it barely existed. Lucas knelt beside him, his fingers pressing firmly against the side of Nick's neck. His face was grim. We're losing him. His voice was taut, breathless. We have to get him out of here. Sarah's hands trembled as she grabbed for her radio, her fingers stiff with cold, barely able to grip the slick plastic. She pressed the button, forcing her voice steady even as dread coiled around her throat. "Dispatch, this is Officer Collins. We have a static." Then a brief crackle. Then nothing. She tried again, shifting slightly for better reception, her pulse pounding with frustration. "Dispatch, do you copy?" Silence. Lucas swore under his breath. No signal. No backup. No way to get help. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Perfect." Sarah fought the rising panic. "We'll carry him back to town." Lucas gave her a sharp look. "Sarah, look at him. Look at both of them. They're barely breathing. We're hours from the station at this pace, and neither of them will last that long." His voice was tight, his frustration barely masked beneath the exhaustion. Sarah's hands curled into fists. He was right. Nick was fading, his body unmoving except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. His leg was broken, his arm twisted behind him at a painful angle. He had been out here for 2 days, 2 freezing, brutal nights alone in the wilderness. His body had already given up the fight, and yet he had survived. Something had kept him alive. Her gaze flickered to the bear. It was watching them again, standing completely still, its dark eyes unreadable. It didn't move toward them. It didn't leave. It simply stayed, waiting, guarding, protecting. Lucas shifted uncomfortably beside her. "Sarah, this isn't normal." No, it wasn't. Nothing about this night was normal. Sarah turned her attention back to Nick, pressing her fingers against his wrist, feeling for the faint, sluggish pulse beneath his skin. "We don't have a choice," she murmured. "We carry him. We move fast." Lucas let out a long breath, the exhaustion in his eyes mirroring her own. He didn't argue. He knew they were out of options. With careful, practiced movements, they hoisted Nick's limp form between them, his weight heavy, uncooperative. Every breath he took was labored, uneven, his body barely responding as they lifted him. His head lolled forward against Sarah's shoulder, his skin cold against hers. The moment they took their first step back up the ravine, the bear moved with them. It stayed close, its massive body brushing past tree trunks, its heavy breaths the only sound in the suffocating silence. Sarah's senses were on high alert, every nerve on edge, her pulse hammering against her ribs. She could still feel it, the presence in the woods, the thing that had been watching them, the thing that had sent the bear growling into the darkness only minutes before. It hadn't left. They were being followed. Lucas sensed it too. His posture was rigid, his free hand hovering dangerously close to his holster, his eyes scanning the dense foliage beyond the trees. The shadows twisted unnaturally, shifting in ways that didn't match the wind, the stillness almost too perfect. Sarah could feel her heartbeat in her throat. Then a branch snapped. The sound sliced through the silence like a blade. Lucas stiffened, his fingers twitching toward his gun. That wasn't an animal. His voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah swallowed hard. "We keep moving." They pressed forward, each step heavier than the last, the weight of the injured men dragging them down, their bodies screaming from the effort. Every breath burned in Sarah's lungs, her vision swimming from the strain, but she forced herself to focus. One step at a time, one foot in front of the other. The bear moved ahead of them, its posture tense, shoulders tight. It knew. It felt it too. Then another sound. Closer this time. Something was following them. Lucas turned sharply, gun raised, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "Who's there?" Silence. Sarah clenched her jaw, adjusting her grip on Nick's dead weight. They had to get out of here. Now. The bear let out a deep, rumbling growl, a sound that vibrated through the air, thick with warning. It planted itself firmly in the path behind them, blocking whatever was lurking just beyond the trees. For a brief, terrifying moment, Sarah thought she saw something. A shape, a figure, just beyond the line of trees. It was tall, too tall, standing unnaturally still, its presence so wrong it made her skin crawl. But the moment she blinked, it was gone. Her breath hitched. Lucas saw it too. His grip on the gun tightened. "Sarah, don't stop," she ordered, her voice shaking. "We keep moving." Lucas didn't argue. They stumbled forward, their muscles screaming in protest, every instinct telling them to run. But they couldn't. They had to carry Nick. They had to save him. The bear moved with them, always close, always watching. The presence in the trees didn't follow. Not yet. But Sarah knew one thing for certain. Whatever had left these men broken, bleeding, abandoned in the forest, it was still out there. And it was waiting. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and fresh linens, a stark contrast to the cold earth and pine that had clung to Sarah's skin only hours ago. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow over the sterile white walls, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, the only sound breaking the heavy silence. Nick Aldridge lay motionless in the hospital bed, his face pale against the pillows, the bruises on his skin stark in the harsh light. His leg was in a cast, thick bandages wrapped around his ribs and arms, for lines snaking into his bruised hands, feeding him the fluids and medication that were keeping him tethered to the waking world. Sarah sat in the chair beside his bed, exhaustion weighing her down, the events of the night pressing against her skull like a vice. Lucas stood near the window, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, staring out at the city beyond the glass. Neither of them had spoken much since arriving at the hospital, too drained, too overwhelmed by everything they had just survived. But there was one thing Sarah couldn't stop thinking about. The bear. It had followed them all the way to the edge of town, staying just within the tree line, its massive form barely visible in the darkness. It hadn't crossed into the streets, hadn't come near the hospital, but it had lingered, watching, waiting. And when the paramedics had finally arrived, when Nick and the other injured man had been lifted into the ambulance, the bear had simply turned and disappeared back into the forest, as if its job was done. Sarah had never seen anything like it. The intelligence in its eyes, the patience, the certainty. This hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been a coincidence. The bear had led them to Nick. It had protected them, and Sarah needed to know why. Nick stirred, a faint groan slipping past his lips as his eyelids fluttered. His breathing hitched, and for a moment, Sarah saw confusion flicker across his battered features. Then his gaze settled on her, his expression tightening, something sharp and unreadable passing through his eyes. She leaned forward. "Nick." Her voice was quiet but firm. "You're in the hospital. You're safe." His throat bobbed as he swallowed, his voice coming out hoarse and weak. "The bear." Sarah's chest tightened. "It's gone, but it brought us to you." She hesitated, exchanging a glance with Lucas before looking back at Nick. "Nick, that bear wasn't acting like a normal wild animal. It knew where you were. It led us straight to you. Can you tell me why?" Nick's face shifted, his expression closing off, his fingers twitching against the blanket. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, finally, he exhaled a slow, shuddering breath. "His name is Boris." Sarah blinked. "What?" Nick's lips pressed together for a moment before he continued, his voice quiet but steady. "The bear. His name is Boris." He shifted slightly, wincing at the pain that flared through his body. "I know him." Lucas let out a low breath, stepping away from the window, disbelief flickering across his face. "You know the bear?" Nick nodded, his gaze distant. "A long time ago, when he was just a cub." His fingers clenched the blanket, as if grounding himself in the memory. "It was years back. I was hiking deep in the woods, further north from here, when I found him. He was small, barely alive. His mother had been killed, poachers probably. There was no way he would have survived on his own." His voice was hoarse, thick with something Sarah couldn't quite place. "I couldn't leave him there." Sarah leaned in, her pulse quickening. "So what did you do?" Nick swallowed hard. "I took him in." Lucas scoffed, running a hand through his hair. "Jesus Christ, you raised a bear?" Nick let out a breathless chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "Not exactly. I didn't keep him forever, just long enough to get him strong. I fed him, took care of him, kept him safe until he was big enough to fend for himself. Then I let him go." His gaze turned toward the ceiling, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought I'd see him again." Sarah felt something shift inside her, the weight of the truth settling deep in her bones. "He remembered you." Nick closed his eyes briefly, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, he did." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Sarah's mind spun, piecing everything together. The way Boris had led them through the woods. The way he had stood guard, never once leaving their side. He hadn't just been helping a lost man. He had been repaying a debt. Lucas let out a low whistle. This is insane. Nick gave a small, pained smile. You don't know the half of it. Sarah studied him carefully. There was something in his eyes, something dark, something that hadn't been there before. What happened to you out there, Nick? His expression flickered, his fingers tightening around the blanket again. He hesitated, and for the first time, Sarah saw something close to fear in his gaze. His voice dropped lower. There's something in those woods. A chill slid down Sarah's spine. Something? Nick's throat bobbed as he swallowed. I don't know what it was. I never saw it. Not clearly. But I heard it. I felt it. His breathing turned shallow. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. Lucas shifted uncomfortably. Nick, you were out there for 2 days. You were injured, dehydrated. Maybe. No, Nick's voice was firm, cutting through the air like a blade. His eyes locked onto Sarah's. I know what I heard. It was watching me. Hunting me. Sarah's stomach twisted. Nick's voice dropped to a whisper. And I don't think I was the only one. The air in the room felt colder suddenly, the weight of his words pressing against her skin like an invisible force. The missing man they had found with Nick, the one they still hadn't identified. Had he been hunted too? Sarah exhaled slowly. Nick, when we were carrying you out, something was following us. Something fast. Nick's face paled. Lucas let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Jesus Christ. Sarah forced herself to stay calm, to keep her voice even. Nick, do you think Boris was protecting you? Nick hesitated. Then finally he nodded. Yes. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. A man and a bear. A bond formed years ago in a moment of kindness. A debt repaid in blood and instinct. But there was still something out there. Something that had left Nick broken, barely alive, abandoned in the forest. And Sarah knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The darkness of the forest was thick and endless, swallowing every trace of moonlight, every familiar landmark, leaving only the frantic rhythm of footsteps pounding against damp earth. Sarah ran, her breath sharp and uneven, her heart slamming against her ribs as she tore through the underbrush, branches whipping against her arms. Every part of her body ached from exhaustion, from the weight of what they were doing, from the fear that clawed at her insides like an animal desperate to escape. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Behind her, Lucas was just as breathless, his footfalls heavy, his pace determined. He was keeping up, barely, his voice raw as he shouted into the trees. Over here! His words sliced through the night like a blade. Meant to be heard, meant to distract. They needed to pull the hunters away, needed to lead them off Boris's trail before it was too late. Nick wasn't as fast. He was struggling, his legs stiff and uncooperative, but he didn't let it stop him. He stumbled over a thick root, barely catching himself before hitting the ground, and Sarah grabbed his arm without thinking, steadying him for half a second before pushing him forward again. Don't slow down, she hissed, her voice barely more than a breath. The distant crack of gunfire tore through the night again, sending a sharp jolt of terror straight through her chest. She didn't know if they were shooting at Boris, if they had already seen him, if he was running just as hard in the opposite direction, deeper into the wilderness, trying to escape the fate that had already been decided for him. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. Boris had saved them. He had led them to Nick, had protected them in the woods, had watched over them like something far more than just an animal acting on instinct. And now, because of human fear, human arrogance, they were going to kill him for it. Sarah clenched her jaw, pushing harder, ignoring the burning in her lungs, the way her legs screamed with the effort. She would not let that happen. They reached a small clearing, the trees breaking apart just enough for the moonlight to cut through, silver light spilling onto the damp ground. Sarah skidded to a stop, her boots digging into the mud as she grabbed Lucas's arm, forcing him to turn to her. We need to split up, she panted. If we stay together, they'll catch us faster. Lucas exhaled sharply, his face pale under the moonlight. He knew she was right. Nick was barely standing, his hands on his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He wasn't going to be able to keep this up much longer. Sarah made a split-second decision. "I'll take Nick," she said, tightening her grip on his wrist before he could protest. "Lucas, you keep going straight. Keep them chasing you." Lucas looked at her like she was insane. "Oh, sure, I'll just personally keep a bunch of armed hunters busy in the middle of the goddamn woods." "Sounds great." Sarah's eyes flashed. "You got a better idea?" Lucas gritted his teeth but shook his head. "Fine, but if I get shot, I'm haunting your ass." Sarah's lips twitched, but there was no time for anything else. Lucas turned and ran, his footsteps loud on purpose, his voice breaking through the trees as he shouted again. "I see him. Over here." Sarah grabbed Nick again, yanking him toward the opposite direction. "Come on." He barely had the strength to protest. They plunged back into the trees, weaving through the thick underbrush, their movements slower now, more careful, more deliberate. They had to disappear, had to make sure that by the time anyone doubled back to search in their direction, they were already gone. Sarah's ears were trained on the distant sounds, the voices of the hunters, the rapid movement through the trees, the occasional snap of a branch, the shouts of confusion as Lucas led them further off course. It was working, but Boris was still out there. The thought made her chest tighten. How far had he gone? Had he understood what was happening, that they were trying to protect him? Or had he stayed too close, confused, waiting for Nick, unwilling to leave the only human he had ever truly trusted? They kept moving deeper and deeper into the woods, their bodies pressing through the tangled mess of brambles and low-hanging branches, until finally the sounds of pursuit began to fade. Sarah slowed, her pulse still racing, her hand still gripping Nick's wrist tightly, as if letting go of him would somehow make all of this fall apart. He sagged against a tree, barely able to stay upright, his breath coming in shallow, broken gasps. She crouched beside him, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Nick," she whispered, "do you think Boris got away?" Nick didn't answer immediately. His head rested back against the rough bark of the tree, his eyes half-lidded with exhaustion, his face slick with sweat. But when he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "He's still close?" Sarah's stomach twisted. "How do you know?" Nick let out a slow breath. "Because he wouldn't leave me." And somehow, Sarah believed him. She stood, scanning the darkness, her heartbeat still too fast, her thoughts still tangled with the weight of everything that had happened. The world was too quiet now, too still, as if something was waiting. Then, from the depths of the forest, she heard it. A low, rumbling growl. Not of anger, not of fear, but of warning. Nick stiffened. "He's here." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. A shadow moved between the trees, slow, deliberate, massive. And then, as the moonlight caught the figure emerging from the darkness, she saw him. Boris. His enormous form stepped carefully through the underbrush, his dark eyes fixed on them, his muscles coiled with silent tension. There was no fear in his stance, no panic. He had been waiting for them. Sarah swallowed hard. "Nick, we have to get him deeper into the woods, somewhere they won't follow." Nick pushed himself up, wincing but steady. "He'll understand." Sarah wasn't sure how that was possible, but she didn't argue. Boris huffed, his breath visible in the cold night air, his head tilting slightly as if listening. Then slowly he turned and walked away, not in fear, not in retreat, but in understanding. Nick exhaled, something breaking in his voice. "He's going where it's safe." Sarah watched the bear disappear into the night, into the deep, untouched parts of the forest where no roads led, where no humans ventured, where he could live. Lucas finally caught up with them, panting, sweat dripping down his brow. "Tell me we're done." Sarah let out a slow breath, the tension in her shoulders finally loosening. For now, they had done it. Boris was safe. But as she stared into the darkness, listening to the distant, echoing silence, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Not yet. The morning air was thick with mist, curling low over the damp forest floor, weaving between the trees like a living thing. The world felt suspended in silence, the kind that came after something irrevocable had happened, a quiet that was not peace but absence, an echo of what had been. The events of the night before still clung to Sarah's skin, the adrenaline gone, but leaving something else in its place, something heavier. The forest had changed. Or maybe she had. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her breath steady but shallow, watching the trees for any sign of movement. The sunlight filtered weakly through the dense canopy, streaking the mist with pale gold, but it did nothing to dispel the cold that had settled deep in her bones. Behind her, Nick leaned against a tree, his body stiff with pain, his injured leg making every movement slow and deliberate. Lucas stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his usual sarcasm absent as he stared at the ground, lost in thought. None of them spoke, because they felt it. Boris was still here. Nick had said it first. After the last of the search teams had packed up, their voices fading into the distance, their vehicles rumbling down the dirt road, Nick had turned to Sarah, his voice low and certain. He's waiting for us. And now, standing in the pale morning light, she knew he was right. A branch snapped. Sarah's breath caught, her fingers twitching at her sides, but she didn't reach for her weapon. She had no reason to, because it was him. Boris emerged from the shadows like something ancient, something belonging to a time before people had carved roads through the wilderness, before fear had turned wild things into monsters. His dark fur was still matted with dried blood, his movements slower than before, but his eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, were the same. He stopped just at the edge of the clearing, watching them, his massive frame blending into the fog that coiled around his legs. Nick exhaled slowly. "Hey, buddy." The words were quiet, but they carried across the stillness like a thread between them. Boris didn't move at first. He only stood there, his breath visible in the cold air, his gaze locked on a Nick as if reading something unspoken. Sarah's throat tightened as she watched, because this was not the wild unpredictability of an animal, not the blind instinct of a creature acting out of hunger or fear. This was understanding. Nick took a step forward, slow and careful, wincing as his leg protested, but he didn't stop. "They're going to keep looking," he murmured. "Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they will." Boris let out a soft exhale, his ears twitching slightly. Nick swallowed hard. "You have to go." Sarah felt the weight of those words settle over them like a heavy snowfall, quiet but inescapable. It was the right thing, the only thing, but that didn't make it easy. Boris stood still, his muscles coiled beneath his thick coat, but he wasn't tense, wasn't afraid. He was listening. Nick's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Go deep," he whispered. "Go where they'll never find you." Boris blinked, slow and deliberate. Then, without a sound, he stepped backward. Sarah felt something crack inside her as she watched. Because Boris was not running. He was not turning and fleeing into the trees in fear, not scrambling away from the presence of humans who had already betrayed him once. He was leaving, by choice, and somehow that made it worse. Nick's breath hitched, barely audible, but he held himself together. Lucas didn't say anything, didn't crack a joke or scoff in disbelief. He only stood there, watching the impossible unfold before him. Boris took another step back, his massive paws pressing into the damp soil, then another. Then he turned and walked away. The mist swallowed him slowly, his dark form blending into the shifting fog, until only the faintest shadow remained. Then nothing. He was gone. Sarah exhaled shakily, realizing only then that she had been holding her breath. She glanced at Nick, at the way his shoulders had stiffened, his jaw tight, his hands still curled into fists. He didn't move, didn't look away from the place where Boris had disappeared. Lucas was the first to break the silence, his voice rough but quiet. "I can't believe I just risked my life for a bear that understands full sentences." Sarah let out something that might have been a laugh if it weren't so hollow. "You did more than that." Lucas sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Yeah, guess I did." Nick finally turned, his movements slow, his face unreadable. "It's over." Sarah wasn't so sure, because as she stared into the trees, listening to the distant rustling of leaves, she felt something. A certainty she couldn't explain, a whisper in the back of her mind, telling her that this wasn't the end. Not yet.